Fantastic, Mr. Fox.
End of 6th week, tortoise number 7, weight 25 ounces. End of 7th week, tortoise number 8, weight 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt. And that evening, Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that "He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back, holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy, guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before. Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course." Rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together, they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man, you are indeed." "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony, looking at the tortoise who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Oh, don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "Simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course." "Will that work?" "Of course it will work." "Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper. "Relams. A tib relams." "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. "I don't mind trying it," Mrs. Silver said. "But look here, I wouldn't want him to get titches small all over again, Mr. Hoppy." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. "Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive." The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked!" She was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe. "I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm." When he was 3/4 of the way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. Friendly suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please, will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. Back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after. P.S. I expect you are wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first of them all. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce, tomato slices, and crispy celery. And in the winters, he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her. Still the much-loved family pet. And Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken